Good evening, my listening friends, and welcome to the DeFi Collective at Let's Talk Radio. I'm Robert Vaughn, and we have Alex Jewell. And today we're going to be talking about a subject I think everybody will find something to love or hate about. We're going to talk about decentralization, democracy, and capitalism, and how they work together, how they can work together better, and how they can benefit us as citizens of the United States and citizens of the world. So we're going to hop right in. Democracy, I think, you know, we want to backtrack a little bit, and I want to ask a question to Alex. Why a democracy?
Well, I mean, I think it's part of that forward progress. Throughout history, almost all the time, what systems get replaced with is usually some system that's a little bit better.
Right.
And so why is democracy, the idea of democracy, whether it's through a republic or not, why is that better? Well, because it gives this systemic approach to representation, right? You know, why do we like to work where we work, or be in the families that we're in, or be in the friend groups that we're in, right? Because you feel represented, you feel listened to, and then you also feel that collectiveness of being a part of something. And democracy gives that to the people, right? Or at least in theory, it allows everybody to engage in the system that affects them without doing much work, frankly. When you have a representative democracy, when you have a republic where you can trust people through a democratic process that you have appointed, you can trust them to do a job, a really important job as part of that complex system, to represent your needs without you having to write policy and understand complicated subjects. Well, that seems like the best of both worlds, right? Where you have something that represents you, and all you had to do is vote. And that's sort of the dream of democracy.
All right. And the opposite of democracy would be totalitarianism, where you would have a pharaoh who would be the king, a descendant from God, the king, and everybody else would be slaves. Now, that's sort of the opposite of democracy. So, you know, as Alex said, we have come a long way. But I know one time I guess I was in junior high school. I asked my father about democracy. You know, I was doing a book report. You remember those days? And, you know, mine was on democracy. And I said, well, how could you best describe democracy? He said, well, it's, you know, he says, when I was a kid, he said, you've probably done this too. You know, it's like a tire, how you roll a tire down the street or in a field. And as long as you keep the tire moving at a pretty good pace, it goes in a straight line. And every once in a while, you got to push a little bit more on this side or on this side to keep it going in a straight line. You know, if it slows down, you got to speed it up or it'll fall. And if it goes too fast, it might get away from you. So he said, that's kind of like what democracy is. He said, you kind of get it going in that direction. He said, but you've got to stay on top of it. And then you've got to tweak it, which means that you have to be involved in the political system. And I think what's happening now is a lot of people who are able to affect the political system are lobbyists and people with a lot of money and a lot of power.
Right.
And the people with the actual votes, you know, probably aren't as effective. One reason, because most people don't vote. And another reason, sometimes when you vote for someone, they don't do what you expect them to do.
Yeah.
So your only choice is if it's a senator, to wait 6 years and vote him out, which hopefully by that time you will have forgotten, and then he'll put some new streets in right before elections and you'll vote for him again.
Yep.
So, you know, I guess there's also a term called liquid democracy. Alex, you want to tell us what liquid democracy is and how it might be used to address a situation where your elected representatives don't represent you like they should?
Yeah, liquid democracy is really interesting. It's something I've been reading up on a bit. Liquid democracy is this idea that you're given a certain amount of stake or expected responsibility in terms of voting on specific things. So instead of just voting for a representative, almost like how some local politics work, where you're voting on certain issues, you're given a certain number of votes, or you're given a certain stake in those issues. What makes it liquid is that rather than just deciding not to participate, you can actually give your votes or end up getting votes from people who, if you don't care too much about a certain issue, or they don't care too much about a certain issue that affects you more, you can share votes amongst yourselves as citizens. I think the example that I brought up last time that we briefly mentioned this was, let's say there's some new issue on the ballot that affects plumbers, and you're not a plumber and you don't care about plumbing. You don't really, you want good plumbing, but you want to be able to trust people who know plumbing better to vote on the issue regarding plumbing and plumbers. So I might pass my votes off to a plumbing union, or some people that maybe I have a friend who's a plumber. I'm like, hey, here's my vote. It allows us liquid transfer and of votes depending on what the issues are. Let's say there's issues that affect certain minority groups more than other people, or certain parts of the country, or there's affects farmers more than people live in urban areas. You can transfer these votes really in a liquid fashion, so that people are voting on things that they really care about. And this is kind of a subtle incentivization to get people to vote on the things that affect them the most, rather than being overwhelmed by a sea of things when only a few of those things are things that they may care about individually. So it actually increases incentivization, is what they found.
Okay. And if the representative didn't vote as you felt they should vote and didn't represent your interests, you could take that vote back. And you would be voting on specific issues. Like, for instance, I'll just give you an example. She's a real world example. Joe Manchin, West Virginia, the poorest state in the country.
Yep.
Probably one of the most polluted, no jobs, worst educational system. Just about anything you can name, they're probably in the bottom 2%.
Yep.
A lot of the things, having to do, they have more floods too. They're affected by climate change probably more than any other state at this time. You would think that, his constituents would want maybe a continuation of the unemployment. I bet if you polled them, they would. Maybe they want something done about climate change. Maybe they want jobs. I'm sure they want jobs. I mean, because basically when the coal mines went bad, the only people that were still making money were the coal companies and the coal producers.
Yep.
It's all been automated. And guess who's a coal producer? Joe Manchin.
Right.
His son is one of the biggest coal producers in West Virginia. And his daughter also is in the coal business. And she's also has a stake in a pharmaceutical company. She increased the price of, I believe it was insulin, like tenfold, from $40 to $450 or something.
So you have a state full of people with diabetes because and higher health risks, less resources to deal with those health risks and live healthy lives, or even education on how to live healthily. And you have representatives who have a vested stake in maintaining their existing rates of poverty and illness and miseducation or lack of education, lack of resources. They profit. The people that are supposed to be representing them profit the most from those states of affairs, and that's a major conflict of interest.
He said he will never support a clean air bill.
Of course not.
Because he's in the coal business. He's in the coal business. But one might ask, with someone who's representing constituents who are negatively affected by that, has a vested interest in seeing that nothing improves, that's like something out of a bad movie, man.
Yeah.
So a liquid democracy would actually allow you to force him to vote a certain way on certain bills.
Yep.
For instance, if you could vote on the Clean Air Act, and you could allocate your votes to someone who's going to vote on the Clean Air Act.
Yep.
So that's just a real world example of how a liquid democracy might work.
Yep.
Because I'm sure when people voted for him, he probably said, well, we're going to get some jobs, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. It hasn't quite materialized yet, but perhaps it will. But a lot of other things, it's pretty bad. There's a lot of toxic waste dumps that hadn't been cleaned up. And he just seemed adamant about not doing anything to benefit his constituents.
He's not going to inject any capital into the emerging industries that would provide jobs.
Yeah. And coal, I mean, it's kind of on the way out. I think the Paris Climate Accords, that's the one big thing. We have one Earth, and it's almost like one person who is blocking the biggest country in the world from moving forward addressing climate change, because he's making money. Wouldn't it just be easier if the government just said, here's $3 billion and you get out, close the coal business, $3 billion, and go ahead and vote for it? So that's a real world example of how liquid democracy might work, because people would be able to vote on certain issues, and not just on you vote for a senator for 6 years and you pretty much got to go along with whatever he wants to go along with for 6 years.
Yep.
And I think that brings us to another point. Let's talk about capitalism and democracy for a moment. Capitalism, the system is constructed in a way that sometimes it's not in the best interest of democracy. It doesn't work in the best interest of democracy.
Right.
Because wealth is concentrated. It's transferred to Jeff Bezos, for instance. And I'm using names and real world examples because this is what everybody knows.
Right.
A lot of times decisions are made not based on what's best for the majority of people, but it's what's best for one person. So I had a student ask me 2 weeks ago. He says, well, can capitalism and democracy coexist forever? And I was like, well, I don't know, because one of the things about capitalism is that the wealth gets more and more concentrated, and the power gets more and more concentrated, and that's sort of the antithetical to democracy.
Right.
How do you see that, Alex?
Yeah, that's a lot of economists, a lot of them being Thomas Piketty, for example. And I strongly recommend people read Capital in the 21st Century by Piketty. He talks a lot about the relationship of free market capitalism and democracy, democratic ideals. The reality is, just like you mentioned, that capitalism, when you play it out in its purest form, concentrates wealth. I mean, the fact is that it moves against rights of the workers. It moves against, if you're just thinking about a unregulated free market, a truly free market, then you're dealing with a progression against democratic ideals, against workers having a stake in their company, being fully represented as workers, and even consumers, right? It even moves against protection of consumers by the system. It moves toward plastic being, it's cheaper to let plastic into the riverways, and it's cheaper to pollute, and it's cheaper to produce cheaper products, and it's less, have less quality control. Like, all of these things are better for the bottom line. And if capitalism thrives on the concentration of capital towards the people who run businesses or own businesses and build them into empires, that's not very democratic, right? And so, when you move into a situation like we're currently in, where it's actually influencing, it's not just influencing the quality of product and the access to product, access to things that are really important with a conflict of interest, for example, in healthcare and medicine. When you have a situation where it's influencing politics as well, it's influencing the bodies that should be regulating it to a certain degree. And not only that, should be solely existing to protect us and represent us. And the real thing that's influencing it is capitalism and capitalistic interests. Then we see how this actually plays out. We see that they don't play nicely together, that they have two separate goals. And we move in a very dark direction, a very dystopian direction when you pair that with an existing industrial revolution, for example, where we're moving towards having even less work, where everything becomes automated. And so when you compare all of those things and you actually play them out, you actually play out the simulation, and you look 50 years down the road, do I see them coexisting peacefully? No. I mean, I think that's ultimately why we need to push for a different economic system.
Right, right. And I think, it's so important now for forward-thinking people to try to preserve democracy. Because I think if you ask most people, do you want your air polluted so that you have 3 times the risk of asthma as someone in another area? And they would probably say no. Yeah. Do you want lead in your drinking water? And they would probably say no.
Right.
And all these things are a result of somebody making money and putting, profit ahead of health, yeah. which is not good, if you're the one that's not on the receiving end of good medical care.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that capitalism does is it makes the things available to people based on your income.
Yep.
I mean, take education, for example. I mean, you can, if you got $1 million or $500,000, well, you can get into Harvard.
Yep.
Be an idiot, or you can get into Stanford, or you can get into USC, and I think that scandal just, that whole college thing, pay to play, it brought a lot of things to light in terms of, what capitalism does and the advantages that it gives you.
Yeah.
It gives you certain advantages that you might not otherwise have. And when it advantages you, it advantages someone that someone else is disadvantaged.
Right.
Because
it's distinctly built on that inequality, right? And one of the biggest arguments that I hear a lot for capitalism, in particular, is, oh, if you work hard enough, if you do the right things, then you have that mobility. And the reality is that capitalism actually moves against mobility. That capitalism at first creates mobility, perhaps compared to previous systems. If you are comparing it to nobility systems and feudalism and things like that, sure, capitalism creates mobility. But when you actually play capitalism out, the concentration of wealth becomes so extreme that you lose mobility. And that's where we're at now, right? When you look at the statistics, people who are born into classes almost always stay in those classes. Now, it's easy for capitalists to look at a few anecdotes and say, well, no, look, this person worked really hard and became a star, and this person worked really hard and became a doctor. But when you look at the number of people that have not only moved class, but moved several classes, those are great examples. But that's, 5 people in a pool of, 20 million people. And that's, when you look at it in ratio of how much mobility there is, and the fact that even if those 20 people had mobility, you also have a situation where 20 million other people don't even have clean drinking water or access to healthcare or access to, anything life-saving or basic living expenses. And, these are failures of the capitalistic system, and they're in there by design. In fact, they knew that they were there by design. Even, when Reagan, for example, was pushing for, more lax regulation for tax breaks and things like this, they fully recognized that with trickle-down economics, we take some loss, at least in the midterm, we would see widening class gaps. They fully admitted we would see widening class gaps and very different quality of life for the classes. The dream was that, it would magically not concentrate, but alas, we've seen that that's not the case. And so,
but trickle down, not trickle up. But they just had
right.
the direction wrong. That's all.
Right. It never magically trickles down. It's not how it works.
It just trickled up and trickled up more and more and more.
Right.
I think one of the problems, fundamental problems, is that there's a lot of money in politics. And I used to be involved in a lot of elections when I was younger. That sort of was my hobby, running elections or helping somebody out, and so I had a little experience with elections on the local and the state level and a couple of national elections. And I've had so many people say to me, he says, Robert, he says, what you're doing is good. He said, but you buy elections. He said, now here's a list of donors and see if you can raise 100 grand by Friday. Just call them, and everybody that's involved in elections will tell you that if you have enough money, usually you can get elected.
Yep.
If you don't have enough money, you're probably not going to get elected.
Nope. Yep.
And the same people, what used to really amaze me is that the same rich people give to both sides.
They do.
They'll give 500 grand to the Republican Party. They'll give 500 grand to the Democratic Party. So whoever wins, they gave 500 grand.
It's all public information. I mean, if somebody works for a big company, you can look up your big company's contributions and see it's pretty much split down the middle in terms of where their money goes.
Yeah.
It's, it's all going to the same place. It's all, ensuring that whoever does win is going to have incentive to value your large corporation's interests in what they do, not the constituents, not how it affects the people. It's how it affects their donors, because it's a selection cycle.
Right. And I think what, one of the things that is interesting is that whoever wins, not much changes for the company. Hedge fund managers gave a ton of money to Obama. They gave a ton of money to Bush. They gave a ton of money to Trump. They gave a ton of money to Biden. And not much has changed for them.
Well, that's the goal. They don't want anything to change.
And they couldn't care less who got elected as long as nothing changes for them.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons that big money in politics doesn't mean there's going to be an even playing surface. And the constituents theoretically can vote, but not too many people vote because they feel like if you talk to people and say, well, why didn't you vote? I say, well, my vote's not going to matter. Well, your vote does matter, but you can see how people could feel that way,
right?
Because they say, well, we're getting screwed by the rich people. You ask the right-wing extremists, what's the problem? People are screwing us. You ask the left-wing extreme, what's the problem? Oh, people are screwing us. And they all say the same thing, the rich people are screwing us. And so maybe it's not the people, maybe it's the system.
And it creates apathy. I mean, the system, if they can't create apathy where people don't engage, they create roadblocks for certain groups of people to engage, and eventually leads to apathy. If we sit around and complain that it's just rich people, they control everything, and then we don't engage because of that, well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If we're not engaging on the right degree and only 10% of people vote, then
it's ridiculous. I mean, the numbers are absurd.
And part of it comes on to education too, because if you simply go on who the media covers, who the media has on the chat, who has the most commercials, who is showing up the most in your Facebook timeline because people are arguing about it, if you're only paying attention to those candidates that are the most visible to you, that money's already working, right? If you're not looking up the full set of candidates to begin with, like this last election where Biden ultimately won, obviously because of institutional preferences for him, but Biden won ultimately because most people couldn't even tell you what the major issues were for half of the Democratic candidates that were running. I mean, I was really into Andrew Yang for a while. I was talking because he was one of the only ones who even mentioned decentralization, and he had the most policy actually written out. He's extremely economically sound, and he also was the only one talking about UBI back then as well. Yeah. And I would notice on the news they wouldn't even pronounce his name right. I mean, they like said his name wrong a couple times. Like I would bring him up to people and people were like, who's that? I don't know anything about. And, I mean, he made it further than we thought. But the reality is that there are a lot of people who voted for the first time because of Andrew Yang, because they actually felt represented. They're like, oh, here's an Asian American who represents me as an Asian American, and people voted for him because they felt represented in a system that should make everybody feel represented. Right. And ultimately what happened is he didn't have as much success. Some of that due to the fact that he may not always be the most natural born public speaker or things like that. But
yeah,
a lot of it comes down to
it's a beauty contest. Coverage. I bet you Matthew McConaughey runs for governor of Texas, he'll win. Because he's just a popular guy that played football at University of Texas, and everybody likes him. He's a movie star. He's got a lot of money,
Right.
But a lot of times, what it is a popularity contest.
Right.
And money helps buy you popularity.
Yep.
It helps get your face out there. And most people, when they go to vote, do not know the issues. They know two things. They know how they feel about the person emotionally, and they know the name that they recognize.
Right.
And a lot of people will just say, well, I've seen his name and my neighbor's got a sign up. That's what I'm voting for. Says, well, where does he stand on this? Or where does he stand on? Well, I don't know, but he must be okay if Joe's voting for him,
Right.
So I think that happens a lot. But I think, money in politics, it's co-opted the system to the point now where I don't know. The way back is not going to be that easy, and that's why I think it's important to have forward-thinking people involved in the system.
Right.
And you see a lot of pushback now. For instance, you see there's 4 or 5 big strikes now. You haven't seen strikes in a long time.
Yeah, we're seeing it. I couldn't even eat Oreos for a couple of weeks because I didn't want to cross the picket line.
Picket line, I know, man.
To find other sweets.
And if John Deere, I think John Deere is on strike.
I don't need any tractors.
Yeah, but that's a long term manufacturing job that's been around for a long time, where people are making a lot of money, and now they can't survive on what they're getting paid.
Right.
But the company's bottom line is doing great, and the stockholders seem to be doing great.
Right.
I think you're going to see, and there are a lot of strikes. So I think people who are workers are becoming more active now.
Yep.
Where after Reagan decertified the PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, there was really a free for all on unions. And I know some states would pitch to getting foreign companies to build auto plants was, hey, we don't have a union, we're a right to work state, Yeah. And that was a pitch. But I think a lot of workers have realized now that if you work at some place like John Deere or Ford Motor Company or something, which are some of the best jobs, if you can't make a living working there, where can you make a living?
Yeah.
And like you say, I think it's more people are realizing now that it's not so much the rich people, it's the system. Who's that 50 cents that don't hate the player, hate the game,
Right. Well, a lot of the rich people exist because of the system. Part of this is what's interesting is some of this is repeats of history, right, in the cycle, and some of it's brand new, right? The brand new part is that somebody could start an online bookstore and suddenly end up halfway to being a trillionaire just 10 years later, and so you run into these situations where we see the effects of a digital economy, of a digitizing fourth industrial revolution, but we also see recycling of things that we saw earlier in the in the 20th century.
Mhm.
Earlier in the 20th century, we saw the progressive era, where we saw people, really rallying around women's rights and workers' rights. We saw a lot of violence around workers' rights. None of us were alive in the early 1900s, but
Mhm.
at least I don't know. Maybe you have a couple older. We have a couple older viewers, but most of us were not alive in the early 1900s, and so we didn't see some of that. But even in mid-century, you saw certain union strikes, resulting in people getting beat up. My parents were actually visiting this weekend, and my grandfather was very involved in the Ford Motor Company union, and that's how he ended up in politics. And there's a famous photo that was on the front page of the Plain Dealer, where my grandfather had been beaten up. And on the front page of the Plain Dealer is him and a couple other union leaders who were standing in the middle of train tracks, just beaten up after a union strike. And so you saw this kind of energy before. We've been here before in terms of people fighting for workers' rights, fighting for social justice, and it creates moments of major shift. We saw moments of major shift with the first industrial revolution. We saw moments of major shift with the progressive era. We saw moments of major shift in the mid-century, where we saw, especially things like gay rights that are popping up. And so we've seen a lot of this, but really what's the parallels with this in the earlier 19th century, especially the 1930s, is that you distinctly have this idea of unknown, right? There's this unknown shift happening in society and culture, where people are very uncomfortable. It's this moment of uncertainty where people are particularly vulnerable to things like fascism and authoritarianism, because they don't want to engage. You have those senses of apathy. And most importantly, you have fear. People are terrified of things changing so much they don't recognize their community, they don't recognize their job, they don't recognize who they are in lieu of all of that. And when they are so afraid of their way of life being altered by change, they are willing to give up, even if subtly. They're not going to acknowledge it. They're not going to admit that they're losing freedoms, but they're going to give up a lot of freedom to some form of very conservative leadership in order to usher in some form of fascism that promises to fight off the bad guys, right? To fight off these boogeymen like immigrants and, and
minorities, gay people.
Whatever
lefties,
group, whatever flavor of the week is attacking them
progressive
now.
lefties.
Right. Education. Oh no, not education, the communist education. So, you have a lot of attacking going on of these boogeymen to mask the fact that they're just going to conserve the existing broken system that's created a lot of this uncertainty and social unrest to begin with. And people are willing to accept that they're, handing the keys of the kingdom over to usher that in. And so you take a lot of the Nazi propaganda in the US from the 30s, where they sold out Madison Square Garden, 1939.
39, yeah.
For get this, the America First rally, where they hung American flags and swastikas behind the speaker. And if you took that speech verbatim from 1939, funded by the German Bund, if you took that speech about against immigrants, about maintaining your Americanness, maintaining your patriotism, fighting off this change and progress. If you took that speech verbatim and a conservative leader today gave that same speech, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And that should be a little frightening because we've been here before, right?
Yeah, we've been here before. Yep. And it's the same playbook. And it always, it never ends good. Fascism never has a good ending. There's always a lot of war and destruction,
right?
And it never has a good ending. So hopefully we learn from the past. Sometimes I question whether we do or not, but hopefully we do learn from the past.
Right.
Decentralization. I think decentralization can help us. In one way, we always talk about the reversal of ownership, reversing the flow of ownership. So the individual has more input into what goes on in society.
Right.
And right now, I think a lot of apathy is due to the fact that most individuals don't feel like they have very much input.
Right.
unless they're billionaires and they've got, a few senators on the payroll and
Right.
something else, So I think decentralization is scary to a lot of people in power for various reasons. One, because it reverses the flow of ownership. I think two, because Bitcoin's doing so good now. Some people are running scared, saying, "Hey, I wonder if this could be a real thing, and it's going to really change the way we do business."
Right.
So it will change the way. Eventually, you'll probably see money flowing from stocks to Bitcoin.
Yep.
And that could be happening already. I mean, it just set another record, I think, today.
Yep.
So you're going to see money flowing from securities, bonds, probably long-term bonds, into cryptocurrency.
Yep.
And I think a lot of people aren't too fond of that because they obviously have a stake somewhere else.
Right.
Also, I think we talked about decentralized, politics. You know, for instance, voting has been, sort of the foundation of democracy, and that's why, it's so heinous and despicable the way that certain states are trying to prevent people from voting.
Right.
What they're saying is that, we're so screwed up that the only way we can get elected is to prevent you guys from voting.
Right.
I mean, not, we have to become more of a Big Tent party. We have to do some more outreach, but we're going to just not let you vote. And we'll just kind of go from there. Decentralization, we talked about this before about decentralized voting. Suppose voting exists on a blockchain like Bitcoin does.
Yep.
It's a ledger. It's transparent. You have a social security number and you have a thumbprint, and that's what makes you different than everybody else. And you get one vote, and it's verifiable. And you wouldn't have to do it on a Tuesday when most working people have to be at work.
Right.
The only worst time they could have did if they said we're going to vote on Monday, when you couldn't miss work, and I think because voting is not really convenient for a lot of people, that's why a lot of people, sometimes you ask people, says, "Why do you vote?" "I just didn't get around to it. I was so busy at work. When I got home Tuesday, I sat down, and when I looked up, it was 7:20, and it was too late." Which is a real concern.
Yeah.
But I think technology will allow us to do a lot of things that we haven't been able to do before. I mean, if there were, and eventually we'll have some sort of blockchain voting where we'll use blockchain as a ledger to verify voting. There could be no vote fraud because it'd be there for everybody to see. And I think, when that time comes, that there would be no reason for you to have to vote between, certain hours of the day, one day a week. You could say, you could vote for over a 2 or 3 month period.
Right.
And I think there has to be some incentive for people to want to engage with democracy. For instance, if you didn't vote, maybe you don't get your tax breaks.
Right. Yeah.
I think a lot of this could be legislated to encourage people, incentivize people, or maybe if you vote, you got an extra tax break.
Right.
You got another $5,000 tax break if you voted.
Yeah. Or UBI or something. If you creating incentives is huge, because obviously you have countries now like you've mentioned Australia before, and their high voting rates is because people have to, which it's just fine. It works. But, I like to think, because my background is tech. And so when I think about a lot of the things that I've worked on that, incentivize human behavior, my master's degree is human computer interaction. So understanding the psychology and cognitive science behind what drives human behavior, especially with technology. And, one of the case studies, for example, that I'll never forget was looking at airports. And this is an example of what's known as dark UX. So it's like
Mhm.
the effect of somebody's behavior without them knowing it. But airports were having an issue with people getting too close to conveyor belts, and trying to grab other luggage at once. And they were putting up signs and using security guards, and none of these things were working, in terms of like getting people to stop crowding the luggage conveyor belts to grab their luggage, which was creating backup, and people couldn't get their luggage, and it creates issues. They tried everything. Well, they brought in some designers, and they decided to slightly incline the floor and put spikes on it. And all of a sudden, they had solved the problem. People just didn't enjoy standing on those spiky little inclines. And so all of a sudden, people were in the right place, not because they had to listen to a sign that told them what to do, or because the security guard had to come around and remind them and move them back. It was because they just weren't comfortable there. And so there's all sorts of interesting ways that technology affects your behavior. Things that we've talked about before with big tech. They keep you scrolling for longer. They keep you arguing for longer. They keep you seeing ads for longer. They keep you coming into stores, right? All these things that shape human behavior. There's a lot there that has been used negatively, of course, like we've discussed, but there's a lot also there that can help us build a system that really benefits people and that is designed for and designed by the people that it affects. How do we incentivize people? Not through telling them or making them, or sending a security guard to every house to say, did you vote? How do we get people to want to vote, right? And that's a very complex question, but by understanding human behavior and human psychology, we have all of the knowledge. Clearly, all these companies have the knowledge to do it, because all of these brands have been secretly doing this for years in terms of like, how do you sell people on things, from watch faces always being on 1010 because of how it shows all the parts of the watch, but also looks like a smiley face subtly, because of the way wine brands put, let's say they want you to buy a $15 bottle of wine, they'll put an $80 bottle right next to it, and they'll hide the $8 one at the bottom. You're going to grab the $15 wine instead of the $8 wine because you're looking at the $60 or $80 wine going, I'm not going to buy that. So our behavior
is popcorn, like the popcorn in the theater, small popcorn is like $5, and a medium is like $6, and then a large is like $6.75.
Yeah, now add $20 to it.
Yeah, so
it's closer to the price, but yeah, it's the same thing where like there's all these subtle ways that we obviously understand how to shape and incentivize human behavior and human decision making, but it hasn't been used in politics because the powers that be, the existing system, don't want higher engagement. They don't want more people voting. They want low engagement. Yeah, they want 200 of their friends voting.
Yeah, that's true.
And so we have to, for those of us aware of these parts, that can be fixed, and for those of us who are really interested in things like decentralization that can improve it, it's up to us to talk about it like we do and implement, really implement designs of like how we can do it better.
Right. We would be remiss if we didn't focus on capitalism for a little while. I think, I had a young lady who was doing she was a sixth grader, and she was doing a report on economics. I guess that's what they do in sixth grade now. A little different than when I was in sixth grade. But she said, well, what is capitalism? When did this all start? And I said, well, you got to research, the capitalism. But she said, well, it said that all these systems come to an end. Are we at the end of capitalism? This is a sixth grader.
Yeah.
She said, are we at the end of capitalism? And I said, well, every system, like everything it's born, it has a lifespan, and it dies. I said, now it's, I said, I can't tell you if we're at the end of it. I said, but, there could be about that time, it's kind of outlived some of the other systems, slavery, feudalism, mercantilism, manorialism, and they all last for about 300 or 400 years and then something else comes along, and they go away.
Yeah.
I think there's something else is already here. Decentralized finance.
Yep.
This is something else, and it probably won't be an easy transition. It never is. I mean, when slavery was an economic system, I mean, it was based on free labor.
Right.
it was an economic system based on free labor,
And there
and
was definitely a fight.
and it was one hell of a fight,
Yeah.
over that system changing. And matter of fact, some people are still fighting.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so I think capitalism has kind of been bailed out by the government. Originally, when it was developed, the concept was developed in France after the French Revolution. It was the Age of Enlightenment, and they said, well, this capitalism, this laissez-faire capitalism, with no interference from the government, this a free market will determine prices and determine who makes money, and if you work hard and have a good blah blah. But I think what's happened now is that every few years the government is having to get involved in it. And so it's not a free market anymore. It's a manipulated market with the government,
Yep.
getting involved. It started with too big to, well, it didn't start with too big to fail, but I mean, it was too big to fail. Well, why do we have to give them $1 trillion? Because they're too big to fail.
Right.
Take down the host. They're also too big to work properly. And then you look fast forward to the PPP loans.
Mhm.
There's companies that were so embarrassed about how much money they were getting, they gave it back.
Yeah. Some of them
Some
didn't.
Some of them didn't. They just said, "Come on, keep it coming."
They still kept it.
Yeah,
you have like Shake Shack that was like, "Oh, you guys caught us. Here you go." And then you had companies like Potbelly Subs that somehow used a loophole to say they were a small business.
Yeah. And it just the savings and loan crisis. And it's like every few years, the government's having to bail out the system. And
Yep.
so you have to, ask yourself, is it the external forces, or is it the system that needs tweaking? Because this system hasn't really worked as a free market system for a long, long time.
Yeah.
You can go back to when with J.P. Morgan, had loaned the United States money to bail them out of debt.
Yep.
One guy has enough money to loan the country money, and I
Right.
guess they eventually paid him back. But that was, I think, the beginning of the banking system, right? The American banking system. And they said, we have to have some sort of system in place to regulate this, so we don't get in this situation again.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's a hallmark of capitalism is the concentration of wealth. Because if you do better, you'll make more money, and eventually you'll make more money. There was a gentleman, a podcast, I can't recall his name, that I listened to, and he was saying that how things that affect people, the mass of people, don't affect wealthy people. He said, for instance, it takes you a long time to get to $1 billion.
Yep.
He said, but you can go from 1 billion to 2 billion in less than a year.
Yep.
And you go to 2 billion to 3 billion. And he said, for instance, if a bank's paying 2% interest, you've got $3,000 in the bank. Well, that's not a whole lot of money. That's what, 30, 60 bucks.
Yep.
But if you've got 300 million in, it's 60 million.
Right.
So there's a big difference, and that money compounds. So it's almost like, when you get to a certain tipping point, when you get to that tipping point, you don't even have to have a brain. There's no way you can possibly lose money.
Nope. Yeah.
You could be the smartest guy on earth, but you might not ever get there.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people get there not just based on what they do, but based on all the people that contribute.
Yeah.
Well,
that's the distinct issue that we're in between, in the relationship between capitalism and the rest of us, is that you have a situation where people are making money. The way that the rich make money on their money is through virtualizations on top of existing markets. You look at things like ETFs and futures, for example, and we could probably do a whole episode on that stuff because Bitcoin ETF just got approved. You've got a lot of discussion around Bitcoin futures and things, and a lot of disagreement, which is really interesting because, futures and ETFs, they kind of started as a way to help the little guy. They were a way of like, if I'm a farmer and I've got crops in some region of the country and I want to make sure that the market remains stable because I can kind of predict how many crops I'll have, then I can maintain stability on my income based on those crops. Take some risk, but not as much risk, right? On the cost of those crops so that I can, stable, so that the market maintain some stability around that commodity. And that helps small farmers, right? Where it doesn't help people is when JP Morgan Chase, for example, virtualizes the cost of gold to the extent, well, now multiple traders own the same ounce of gold in other words, on ounces of gold that don't even exist on the planet. And you have distinct manipulation of commodities markets at the expense of the rest of us, right? This is the issue, is that those virtualizations at that scale, because we were talking about scale as well, right? If I have $3 million of crops or $300,000 of crops, no big deal. If I have $1 billion of futures related to a commodities market as a trader who's never even touched the commodity before, well, now I'm affecting real people's lives, and I'm affecting, currency and affecting the value of a dollar. I'm affecting these things without having a real stake in them. And I'm manipulating a market for my own gains, only risking 10% to begin with, and then making back 200, 300, 400% on it, 10, up to 10x. I mean, that's insane to think about it. And so we've run into a situation where we're creating virtualizations of cash on top of our existing markets. And that's stealing. It's stealing directly from the individuals who live paycheck to paycheck, who rely on every single dollar being worth a dollar. The same dollar that they had this month being the same dollar that they have next month for their rent, for the price of bread, and so we're creating these record inflation models. And this is crazy. We saw the article a couple days ago where they literally were discussing the fact that they could go print off or mint $1 trillion coin to help us not default on our loans as a country. I mean, it sounded like The Onion. I was reading it. They were like, yeah, we're probably not going to do it, but we could go mint $1 trillion coin using the precious metals we have. And then we could deposit it by helicopter within minutes. And I was like, it sounds like a joke. But imagine adding $1 trillion more to avoid defaulting and creating it out of thin air on the backs of everybody in the country who relies on a dollar cost, being worth a dollar. So that's why things like cryptocurrencies are becoming so much more valuable.
And I think ETF Bitcoin is going to probably be an attempt to regulate the price of Bitcoin or manipulate the price of Bitcoin.
Exactly. More virtualization on a commodity that doesn't need it.
Yeah. I don't think it'll be successful. But I think, one of the things that really boggles my mind is the rehypothecated treasuries. Now, you talk about the system being rigged. Rehypothecated treasuries are treasuries that investment banker can get that they can loan out to a bank, and they can get interest paid on those treasuries. Say they get 5% interest on the treasuries. Now imagine if you could loan the same set of treasuries out 10 times. You could get 50% interest at 5%, half the cost of those treasuries every year.
Yep.
Those are called rehypothecated treasuries, and that's legal to do that. Mm-hmm. And as you brought a good point up a couple of weeks ago, rehypothecated gold futures.
Yep.
Where they're selling the same gold to multiple people, and that's not like I don't know what you call it, a Ponzi scheme, but it's like a flim flam. It's like an old.
Yeah, it's essentially. It's essentially what it is.
Right? Man would do,
Yeah.
Yeah, you sell. It's like selling the same car to 8 different people, but they use it at different times, and they'll never know the difference unless 2 people want to use it at the same time. It's like the gold. The only way, rehypothecated gold there will be a problem is if everybody wants their gold.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, because of the United States at one time, it was illegal to own gold and to hold
Right.
gold, unless it was in jewelry, but yeah, reapothecated treasury, the system works very good for a few people,
Yep.
but on the backs of most people, because I mean, you take, for instance, a company like Amazon. He says, well, I'm Jeff Bezos. I built this company, blah, blah, blah. But, your trucks use the highways and the freeways that everybody pays for. And you, along with your 100,000 employees, kind of make this thing go. So it was your idea, but you didn't build it by yourself,
Right.
and when you don't pay any taxes on making billions of dollars, you don't pay any taxes. The guy that's cleaning the bathrooms pays more tax than you do, and your
Right.
company. Then there's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with that. And people. I know Warren Buffett was almost embarrassed by it. He said, "Man, when someone told him once that his secretary paid more tax than he did." And he said, well, I agree, guys like us should pay more taxes, but
Right. It's a systemic thing. I mean,
yeah,
the billionaires, they would pay more if they had to, but they have a whole teams of accountants that their job is to do taxes within the system that's designed for them. And of course, billionaires should be more, rather than just agreeing, they should be doing things about it, but they're not incentivized to. Again, it comes down to incentivization. How do we incentivize things? Well, we have to design better systems, because otherwise we have these inequalities. And this goes back to our democracy versus capitalism discussion, and it goes back to what's better with decentralization and the equality that comes with it. But if you have companies like Citadel, whose cost of business involves paying fines for all the crimes they break in a year to make billions of dollars, and those fines are only millions of dollars, that's great. But if somebody needs to steal diapers to take care of the child and they go to prison for a year, do you have a society that's designed for people doing the right thing, or do you have a society that's designed strictly for the rich to accumulate wealth? And it's distinctly that capitalistic control of democracy that's allowing that inequality and those gaps to continue widening. And that's why we have to think of some differences. We have to redesign it. We have to think differently.
We have to redesign it, and we have to redesign the economic system, which I think is already happening, because the economic system determines what the political system is like. I mean,
it's all economics. Yeah.
I got in an argument with an economics professor once. He said, well, politics determine economics. And I was like, no, it's the other way around.
No, money controls everything around us. It's all economics.
Politics. He believed you had the economics, but you had because of politics. I said, well, you have, economics trumps politics. I mean, it does it more now than it ever did. When like the tax cut, the Trump tax cut that they had 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, and a lot of companies were saying, well, we really don't need a tax cut, but if you're going to give it to us, we'll take the money.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to give it to us.
Yeah. So okay, well, it's been a great show tonight. I think we touched upon some subjects that we'll probably get a lot of emails on. And before I go, our email address is the DeFiCollective@gmail.com. And we're on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe. You like us on Facebook. You can find us on YouTube at the DeFi Collective. Also at Let's Talk Radio, RADYO, radio with a Y, Let's Talk Radio, and the DeFi Collective. So please like and subscribe. And good Lord willing, we'll be back next week. And we're going to try to talk about some more things that might be of interest to people. I'm sure you probably know that there's our economic system is sort of in flux right now, and if you don't know, you might want to stay abreast, but, decentralized finance is coming on. And the reason I know it's coming on because all the banks are starting to get involved in it now before everybody else does, when they talk about, having futures on Bitcoin. And last week they were saying, Bitcoin's just a fad. Well, that tells you that, it's here to stay. Cryptocurrency is here to stay. I don't, and just want to, I always tell people, when you want to evaluate your crypto, read the white paper. That's probably the most important thing with decentralized finance, is to read the white paper. So, like I said, please like and subscribe. And until next week, have a great week. And Alex, any closing thoughts?
Whenever Mark Cuban says to do something, probably do the opposite.
I'm saying you'll make money. Yeah. Yeah. That's good words of wisdom. So we will see you next week. Have a great week and make some money, do some good, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Have a good one.